was an exhausted farm. It was a nation which was desperately in need for an urban renewal which did not have since the Great Depression of the 1930s. So what was very evident to me even then was that a huge power vacuum is going to open. When the single biggest hegemon, the preeminent outside balancer of power, starts retreating from its global growth, nature abhors the vacuum. And somebody would obviously step in to fill that vacuum. That somebody could be a multipolar arrangement, but overwhelmingly it looked that it would be China trying to step up to the plate. And then COVID-19 happened, and the entire world went through a complete toss, and there was a kind of a hiatus. When President Trump came back, he had in fact reversed all the postulates of US foreign policy, which had underpinned his first term. And the United States very rapidly moved from exceptionalism to transactionalism in its foreign policy. And that transactionalism actually what defined us. The US intervention in Venezuela, and now the US intervention in Iran, primarily because it is not only about what is happening in the Middle East. It is also about the United States trying to recap its greatest strategic rival, China, which had two very effective counterweights in terms of resource extraction. One was Venezuela and the other was Iran. So, therefore, this book actually comes out of the conviction that the world order as we knew it, if at all there was a world order between 1945 and now, that world order had collapsed. Nothing had emerged. So we were really in the age of monsters, as Antonio Gramsci says. Or were we going to regress back to the foundational template of the 17th and the 18th century, which had defined the conduct of affairs between nations? And that really is the essence of this book.
So how do you see the West Asia conflict playing out now? In your book, you track the way the global order has changed with the two world wars and the Cold War and so on, and now this orderless world. So how is this going to play out? And how is this going to impact India?
Number one, there is not one war. There are many wars which are playing themselves out simultaneously in the Middle East. So then, one is of course the conflict which has happened between Israel, United States of America, and Iran. Number two is the larger civilizational conflict between the states of the Greater Middle East. The middle powers or the regional powers in the Greater Middle East, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, and of course Iran on the other side. The third is the attempt by the United States to ensure that for the foreseeable future, at least the next decades of the 21st century, the dominance of the US dollar remains. And so therefore, if you look at the various moving parts of this conflict, you would see a pattern emerging. And when I refer to Venezuela and Iran earlier, the desire now to give Russia an off-ramp because Russia's exhausted after the Ukraine war. Already there's talk about opening the oil pipelines. The Central European states are talking about that. So essentially, if you have China and you have Venezuela and Iran kneecap, you've given an off-ramp to Russia, which has lost about close to 600,000 people in this conflict with Ukraine. Essentially, then the United States will be able to negotiate with China on its own terms. And that means that the BRICS arrangement, minus the two big players, one exhausted, Russia, China wanting to remain relevant, essentially almost spells the demise of BRICS. So from India's point of view, that is something which should worry us, because the BRICS was not only an acronym coined by a consulting firm to try and sell a report. It was something more than that, and it was really the foundation of multipolarity that we have been striving for. In economic terms, it leaves us very badly off. 4 weeks, the Straits of Hormuz has been closed. For every $10 rise, $10 rise in the price of crude oil, we add $10 to $15 billion to our import bill, and this is only crude oil. Then there is LNG. We are hugely dependent upon Gulf exports. The largest LNG field in Qatar is out of action. May not come online for 3 to 5 years, going by the estimates available. Then there is fertilizer. We are the largest importers of fertilizer from Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates, especially the nitrogen-based fertilizers, which constitute almost the bulk of the usage which our farmers do. So essentially, we are going to be economically really, even if the war was to stop tomorrow, we are going to remain hugely economically stressed, because going by all the predictions which are available, the crude oil is going to remain above 100 for maybe all throughout 2027. In addition to that, even if things were to normalize, before the insurance premiums come back online, which has a window of anywhere between 60 to 90 days, those ships are not going to sail. Because ultimately ships sail not because you give them nebulous costs. Ships sail because there are insurance premiums and war risks that have to be in place. And those insurance premiums and war risks are completely absent today. So from an economic standpoint, not only us, but all the energy-consuming economies of Asia, be it China, be it South Korea, be it Japan, the big consumers of imported hydrocarbon energy from West Asia, are going to be in a problem. Our problem gets even a little more compounded because we have a huge diaspora across the greater Middle East or West Asia. 10 million people working in different geographies which are now conflicted with each other. So we are really between the rock and the hard place. Having said that, I'll end with just one sentence. There are certain fundamental postulates which underpin the foreign policy of every country. And in our case, we have been fairly even Stevens across administrations in calling a spade a spade. And therefore it is disappointing when India does not call out regime change through coexistence. It is disappointing when India does not call out targeted assassinations of leaders in different geographies or their abductions. I'm not going into the merits of the regimes. It is disappointing when India does not condole the killing of 196 innocent school children in a missile strike which has been called out by none other than the New York Times. So therefore, I think the crisis in West Asia is a reason for us to also introspect, because strategic ambiguity should not translate itself into strategic silence. And over the past 28 days, the silence of the government unfortunately has been dead.
You, at one point, you written about India's relationship with Russia on the decline, and you said that given that India's strategic and economic future does not lie with Russia, it may have been a short-term tactical gain to buy cheap oil from Russia.
So when I led the debate in Parliament on the Russia-Ukraine war in the March 2022, and we were buying about 1% of our crude oil needs from Russia at that point in time. And I had even then said that there is no need for us to change our energy purchase profile because India can afford to go down the path that it has been going down in terms of its energy imports over the past 5, 7, 10 or even longer. But the argument from the government then was that, we import 88% of our crude oil needs, we import 47% of our LNG. If we are getting cheaper crude oil, why should we not go for it? From an economic standpoint, it made sense that if you were getting a cheaper energy, so obviously any government which has to pay such a huge import bill would take that call. But given the fact that it was happening in the circumstances of Russia's unequivocal transgression on Ukraine's sovereignty, it was troubling. And then 3 years down the line, when the Trump administration decided to take a different line, you suddenly decided to pull back. By the December of 2025, your crude oil purchase from Russia had dropped dramatically. Now, if the logic that cheap crude is what India wants was the position taken in the March-April of 2022, that premise remained valid even in the December of 2025. Then why buckle? And now, ironically, it is not only Russian crude which is back on the line, but even Iranian crude is back on the line. But the only thing is, the Russians are no longer selling it to you at a discount. The Russians are actually charging a premium on it now. So therefore, the point I was trying to make is, there are certain moral underpinnings of India's foreign policy, irrespective of the fact that at times you have to maneuver linearly between the rock and the hard place. And those positions you should maintain. For short-term gain, you should not sacrifice the longer positions which really go back to the genesis of our foreign policy, which was the Asian Relations Conference in 1946.
So you started your book with a chapter on China, its rise, and you said it's acquired a more assertive and potentially coercive character, China's rise. So from an Indian perspective, what red lines must New Delhi draw to protect its strategic space without slipping into an outright confrontation with China? And in fact, we seem to have avoided it. If you see Doklam, we kind of we didn't say anything outright about China getting into our territory or China grabbing a part of it.
You see, the fundamental problem is that both India and China came to their destiny from two very different places. The Chinese Communist Party ascended to office in 1949 after a very bitter civil war, and then the two protagonists of the civil war coming together to fight the Japanese and then fighting each other after the collapse of the Qing dynasty in 1912. And India came to its destiny in 1947 through a unique non-violent struggle for freedom at a point in time when 17 million people had died in the First World War, another 81 million people had perished in the Second World War. You saw the use or the destructive potential of the atom in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the August of 1945. And so therefore we both came to our destinies from very different places on the planet. And that's why, and this is my understanding, that China and India have not really understood each other. In fact, very early in the relationship, you had the Chinese aggression on Tibet. Tibet uh, was autonomous. The Chinese exercised a very loose sovereignty on it between 1912 and 1956 when they took it over. And then you had the 62 border war, and there was a large hiatus, a long period of silence in the relationship before Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi picked up the threads in 1988. And therein lies the contradiction. India's and China roughly had the same GDP in 1979, 1980. Today, the power differential between India and China is 5:1, and it is across the board. We've had this 4.5-year long border standoff with China. There is still opacity with regard to certain buffer zones as to how ultimately it is going to really play itself out. And then all throughout that period, our trade relationship with China kept going up and up. We have an adverse balance of trade of $100 billion with China as we speak. So in a sense, when I say people don't like it, but we seem to have funded the Chinese transgressions against us by ourselves. And therein lies our dilemma, that how do we safeguard our territorial integrity and sovereignty without really breaking the trade relationship till the time we do not develop self-sufficiency. And our problems are going to be compounded if the current conflict in the Middle East, which may be abruptly terminated by the American administration, which commenced it in the first place, notwithstanding the negotiations in Geneva, then the two very aggressive beneficiaries of that would be, in the regional context, Iran, and in a global context, China. And that is going to further compound our problem. So how do you really manage this relationship? It's going to be a tough one going forward, because we thought that the AUKUS would balance the aggressive behavior of China post Xi Jinping taking over in 2012. But now the principal linchpin of Quad has itself become very mercurial and erratic. And it really sort of leaves us on our own. And in many ways, we are back to 1979, when the ducks and drakes of the United States, Pakistan, and China, and there is no solution. So we are going to, we'll have to, navigate turbulence over the next couple of years.
Our military analysts or the retired jailers often warn of a two-front war, because with China and Pakistan getting together. So how real is that? Do you think, considering Pakistan is also on the decline, do you think that is a possibility?
During the kinetic elections between India and Pakistan between the 7th and the 10th of May 2025, you actually uh, saw a kind of a trailer of that two-front situation. Uh, the, the Chinese Western Theatre Command was feeding into the Pakistani Central Air Command, which overlooks India. And you in fact had the Deputy Chief of the Air Staff go on record to say that the Chinese actually used this kinetic engagement as a laboratory to live test, some of their theoretical postulates. So therefore, a two-front situation for India is a strategic reality. And it's a strategic reality going back to 1964, when the Pakistanis conceded the Sashram Valley to China. And therefore, over all these years, we have, whenever we have been in conflict with either Pakistan or China, we've been able to manage it. But post 2012 and the China-Pakistan economic corridor coming online, as also the Chinese investments in Gwadar, in Hambantota, in Maldives, in Myanmar, in Nepal, the two-front situation is a strategic dilemma that we must seriously prepare for. And as I said, we really saw the precursor of that in the kinetic exchanges last year. So yes, that is a reality we have to contend with. And that's why in one of my earlier books on the national security challenges that confront India, one of the fundamental points that I made was that India either has to bring down its national security challenges, which is find a modus vivendi with both Pakistan and China, or it has to exponentially up its defense expenditure. And we are at about roughly 1.9% of our GDP on defense, now going back almost a decade. In fact, at one point in time, when Dr. Murli Manoj Joshi, who was the chairperson of the Estimates Committee, had done a report on defense preparedness, we were at 1.6%, which was roughly what we were in 1962. At that level of defense to GDP spending, we can't sustain the kind of challenges that confront us. So therefore, we either will have to exponentially ramp up. And China did that. You see, between 1979, when China started opening up, and 1995, China's defense spending was very low. When the Taiwan Straits crisis happened in 1995, and the US sailed its aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Straits, China upped its defense spending double digit for the next 2 decades, from 1995 to 2015. And now from 2015 to now, they grew 7.2% year-on-year increase in defense budget, which also, if you go by what Western analysts say, are numbers which do not really tell the true story. So therefore, we need to take certain hard calls. Just getting high on the testosterone of nationalism is not going to safeguard national security. You need to put your money where your mouth is. And that money, unfortunately, we are not seeing over many, many years now.
We hear a lot about the government investing in drones, Ukraine being the shining example of how a small country, which everyone thought Russia would just overrun it, still giving up a very good fight. So India seems to be relying more on AI, especially, we don't, the theory seems to be, the strategy seems to be, we don't need, in the new way in which the wars are fought, we don't need boots on the ground. We need eyes in the sky, we need drones, we need AI. And how do you about it. You mentioned it in your book as well. So how do we take it forward?
So essentially, the conflict in between Russia and Ukraine, or the dynamic exchanges between us and Pakistan last year, both of them underscore that the nature of warfare has completely transformed itself. So, if you are even a weaker power using a symmetric warfare, and that's been the revolution in military affairs, you can still hold a bigger adversary off. And Ukraine is in fact a classical example whereby they have innovated on drones, now coming to cardboard drones which are as cheap as $500 a pop, but carry a lot of destructive potential. But herein lies the paradox again, and Mrs. Misra in her opening remarks was talking about AI and the frontier technologies. So, China last year on AI alone spent $95 billion. And out of that, $67 billion or $56 billion was government spending. Uh, Five American companies, Meta, Google, Amazon, and two of the other big tech majors, are going to spend $700 billion on AI in the current fiscal. Our spend is 1,000 crores. We are going to be spending, close to about 1,200 crores or something over 5 years. I mean, that's the AI mission. We've allocated 1,000 crores this year. So with that kind of a gap, you will only see the power difference increase. And this is only artificial intelligence. If you add on semiconductors, you add on robotics, you add on the Internet of Things, you add on cyber offensive and defensive capability, the menu really becomes endless. And that is why I'm saying, because look at the size of the budget of the government of India. After all, this would come out of the budget of the government of India, 53 lakh crores. We have a revenue stream of 36 lakh crores. We mobilize about 17 lakh crores from the market, and about 47 lakh crores is committed liabilities. So the wiggle room which the finance minister or the government has is only about 5 lakh crores. And that is why we've been really flying by the seat of our pants. And therefore we need to sit back and seriously go back to the drawing board, because the fact that the old order is completely collapsed. You are back to what I call, what Cardinal Rightu had coined, raison d'etre, which is each country acting in its own best interests, and the balance of power as yet has not emerged. So given the fact that we may be on our own for the foreseeable future, some of these really profound challenges require a political consensus across the board, like the one we constructed on economic liberalization. Because ramping up capacity is also going to be a decade or a 2-decade affair. And then you have to manage the integrum also. So these are very, very serious national security challenges, and unfortunately, neither in Parliament and nor in substantial sections of the media, leaving aside one or two newspapers, yours being one of them, is there any serious discussion on these issues?
So what the way out you feel is everyone should come together and sit down and track it out?
See, ultimately, it comes down to money. You can only create capacity if you have the ability to be able to fund it. You need to energize or ignite the animal spirits of corporate India. Get them on board with regard to defense and especially defense research and development. You need to build those partnerships where you will be able to get proprietary technology. And you need to do it super quick, because you are not the only one who's doing it. There is everyone else who's playing the same game. Look at what happened between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The Armenians thought that they had superior military and they would just walk over Azerbaijan. And then the drones came in and just turned the whole thing around. So therefore, there has been a complete revolution in military affairs. You move from an informationized battlefield to an intelligence-ized battlefield. The next frontier is going to be the cognitive domain. It's going to be the battle for the human mind. So these are the issues which public policy professionals and those in the space need to apply themselves to, that given the financial constraints that we have, how do we try and create and craft a strategy which would ensure that our strategic autonomy and the space that we have carved out for ourselves, we are able to maintain them as long as the world remains in this turbulence, which seems to be the case going forward, at least for the next 5 to 10 years.
You've also spoken about how India has always adopted you've also written about how India has always adopted a neighborhood first policy. But the question is, have our neighbors also adopted an India first policy? Which doesn't seem to be the case.
Don't ever ask that question to Minister Jaishankar, because he replied in a very injured tone, and I reproduced that conversation in the book when I asked him in Parliament. But do any of India's neighbors have an India first policy? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. Obviously, every nation has its own strategic imperatives. So therefore, you cannot always expect that if you are walking the extra mile, it's going to be reciprocated en toto. However, having said that, what has really complicated India's neighborhood trajectory, of course, is the legacy of partition. Quay, our western neighbor, which we've not been able to sort out. Its unsettled borders with China, the LAC and the McMahon line. But more than that, the economic muscle of China, which they started visibly demonstrating through the One Belt, One Road initiative, the BRI, the Belt and Road initiative, that has complicated things in our neighborhood. And so therefore, with Chinese investments in Sri Lanka, of course, the popular notion is that Sri Lanka got into that debt trap because of China, but which is factually not correct. But China has substantial investments in Sri Lanka, in Maldives, as I earlier spoke, in Pakistan, in fact, on our eastern flank also now. So that is a relationship or a situation that we'll have to manage. Now, look at what has happened with Bangladesh. Of course, after the new government has taken over, I do hope that things get better. But our problems with Pakistan actually go back to the creation of Bangladesh. So when we redrew the political map of South Asia in 1971 and created a new nation called Bangladesh, that is liberated East Pakistan, the West Pakistani military, the deep state, has never ever forgotten that. And that's why they took two seminal decisions. One, they will acquire nuclear weapons, the Multan Conference of the 24th of January 1972, and they will bleed India with 1,000 cuts. And then our relationship with Bangladesh has also been very topsy-turvy over the decades, which begs the question, and that is why we need to really look within, that what is it that we need to do to ensure that South Asia, which if it's our Monroe Doctrine, if we consider it to be our eminent domain that we do, we keep it on board. And given the assertiveness of China, it is becoming a difficult balance to tread. And obviously, till recently, we had a default strategic partnership with the United States. But now, the partnership of the United States with all its allies across the board, from NATO to Japan, all those relationships are today strained. I mean, President Trump calls out the European leaders on a daily basis. So that's why, in this situation, I think we should focus more on diplomacy, uh, treat the next 2 decades as space for our consolidation. Our time will come, but we should be very, very careful that we should punch to our weight and not try and punch above it.
So, one last question, and you've written that for India to preserve its strategic autonomy, it must remain internally cohesive, and that pluralism is no longer a luxury that can be taken for granted. It is the biggest antidote to external challenges.
So, if you go back to the foundation of the Indian state, the British actually managed the periphery of India in the northeast and the northwest through treaties, because the British were an empire. So they never thought in terms of fixed boundaries. They always thought in terms of the periphery as a frontier. But when we transited from being a British subject state to an independent nation, we had fixed boundaries. And we tried to negotiate the turbulence in the northeast and the northwest through constitutional guarantees. And that is what was Article 370, 371, 371A, B, C, D, which deals with different states in the northeast, and 370 dealt with Jammu and Kashmir. When you weaken any of those constitutional guarantees, because they were given in the context of a particular security situation which the Indian state surmounted, it has implications on the others. And even today, if you look at it, India's biggest national security challenges either lie in the northwest or the northeast. You had Punjab between 1980 and 1995, Jammu and Kashmir, the Pakistani intervention, and of course an element of indigenous and homegrown terrorism in Jammu and Kashmir, and then you've had the problems in the northeast. And that is where the bulk of your minorities also live. So therefore, as a country, or any government which wants to run a country as complex and diverse as India, has to do it from the center. Because if you do not gravitate towards the middle, even if you come from an extreme position, in your political rhetoric, it becomes difficult. And Manipur is a classical example of that. And that is why I'm saying, given the fact that we are in a difficult neighborhood, pluralism is not a luxury that that some people consider it to be. Pluralism, or maintaining India's pluralistic traditions, is the biggest national security imperative that we have. And if we weaken pluralism, and unfortunately because of the slow burn of polarization, that's been very taught over the past 12 years, you end up weakening national security. And that's what the whole chapter on national security in the book is all about.
Thank you so much. On that note, we've had such an insightful conversation. I'm sure all of us are going back much enlightened. Thank you very much. Not at all. Not at all.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, ma'am, for that insightful session. I would now like to invite Director of Pashmira Textiles and our festival coordinator, Mr. Afan Yeswi, to honor sir with a shawl.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Please give the speakers a round of applause. Before the algorithm told you what to watch, there was Doordarshan. One channel, whole country, no remote, no scroll. Just India, together 6 to 10. On that note, I would like to invite Madam